our conversation today is focused on the education employers. What is it that they can do to improve education workplace inclusion? Today, we're very fortunate to have a very diverse and esteemed panel of experts to share their wisdom, insight, and knowledge with us. A quick word about the format. If the audience have any questions for the panelists, please direct them in the Q&A. And so that's on the lower left-hand, lower bottom side. You should see a Q&A tab, and you can just send your questions there. If you have any comments, type them in the chat box, and someone will ensure the message is relayed to the presenters. Presenters and panelists, we're going to provide introductions now. And as we introduce you, if you could wave or acknowledge introductions so the audience who are not familiar with you can kind of put a connection for the name and the face, that would be great. I'd like to start off by introducing Dr. Susie Hardy. She's a clinical assistant professor and program coordinator of the Master's in Education Specialist Programs and Education Leadership Policy in University of South Carolina. She analyzes effective school leaderships in high-need urban and rural schools and is a former school administrator.
Since you did my wonderful introduction, I have nothing else to say, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Dr. Simone Goss is currently a research associate at the University of South Carolina, whose scholarly interest largely focuses on the issues of privilege and power and how they impact gender equity, racial equity, and leadership diversity in higher education. Specifically, her research examines the continued disproportionality and intersectionality of race and gender in educational leadership through historical and contemporary contexts, the experiences of minoritized students in higher education, faculty diversity, and mentorship.
Kathleen Cunningham is an assistant professor of educational leadership and policies in the Wardlaw College of Education at the University of South Carolina. Prior to her doctoral studies at the University of Iowa, she was a middle school teacher in Wisconsin. After earning her PhD in educational leadership and policy studies, she served as a postdoctoral research associate for the University Council of Educational Administration at the University of Virginia. And on top of all of that, she's also a great professor because I'm having a class with her right now. So.
All right, our next presenter will be Dr. Spencer Platt, who is an associate professor of higher education administration and interim director of the Center of Innovation in Higher Education at the University of South Carolina. He earned his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. His Master's of Science degree is from the University of Dayton, and he holds a bachelor's degree from the University of South Carolina as well. Dr. Platt has nearly 20 years of experience in student affairs, diversity and equity, community engagement, and academic affairs. His research interests include Black males in higher education, access to higher education, critical race theory, mentoring relationships between faculty and students of color, and the socialization of diverse faculty at predominantly white universities.
Thank you so much. Those are our group of presenters. And so next I will introduce the panelists. If I butcher any pronunciation of anything, just go ahead and jump in and correct me. So I will start first with Dr. Michelle Dow. She received her BA in economics from Wesleyan University and her PhD in education leadership from Lesley University. While coming out as a trans woman on the job in Cambridge, Massachusetts public school, she surprisingly experienced many of the same negative responses as a trans educator throughout the US. As a result, she changed the topic of her doctoral dissertation to focus on the experience of trans educators and subsequently wrote a book on the same topic published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2020. Her book details the commonalities of workplace exclusion, discriminatory hiring practices, and efforts to terminate trans employees through the guise of poor performance. She's an associate lecturer at the University of Massachusetts, Boston.
All right, and next up we have Dr. Mario I. Suarez, who is an assistant professor in the School of Teacher Education and Leadership at Utah State University. Dr. Suarez's research interests include queer and trans studies in education, STEM persistence, demography of sexuality and gender, curriculum studies, pre-service teacher education, and quantitative research methods. Dr. Suarez centers the experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex individuals in educational contexts through a primarily quantitative lens.
Dr. Bridget Turner Kelly, Associate Professor of Student Affairs in the College of Education at the University of Maryland, has previously served as Program Chair and Associate Professor for Higher Education and Student Affairs at both Loyola Chicago and Seattle Universities. During her faculty experiences, Dr. Turner Kelly published more than 25 articles and book chapters. Her scholarship covers women faculty of color in higher education, the experiences of Black women in predominantly white institutions, and the professional development of women students of color. Her work highlights the experiences, retention and advancement strategies, and gendered systems that impact women of color in higher education institutions.
Next, we have Dr. Gregory Vincent, who is an executive director and professor at the University of Kentucky and an acclaimed civil rights attorney. He previously served as Vice President for Diversity and Community Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin, where he also was a professor in the School of Law and in the Department of Higher Education Administration, where he held the W.K. Kellogg Professorship in Community College Leadership. Vincent was named the 2016 Educator of the Year by the University of Pennsylvania and received the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law Distinguished Service Award in 2012.
Thank you. Tiffany Wright is an associate professor in education foundations department at Millerville's University and has served as an educator and school leader in various settings for over 20 years, including in juvenile facilities, comprehensive high school, and a career technical high school. She taught English and then served as a school administrator for 6 years while earning her EDD from Johns Hopkins University. She has published numerous papers on issues related to LGBT educators.
Dr. Michelle DeYoung is Dean of the School of Education and Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. Throughout her career, Dr. Young has served on multiple policy and academic boards, including the American Educational Research Association SIG Executive Board and the National Policy Board for Educational Administration. Additionally, she's published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Her scholarship focuses on the research and leadership preparation and policy implications, critical policy analysis, and educational leadership development. Dr. Young's work supports efforts to diversify educational leadership in higher education and the school leadership pipeline.
Right. Dr. Wardell C. Hunter III currently serves as the Director of Leadership Development at Atlanta Public Schools in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Hunter has experience as a teacher, director, academy leader, assistant principal, and dean of instruction. In addition to his K-12 responsibilities, Dr. Hunter is a part-time faculty member at Georgia State University.
And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Doug Smith, who is an associate professor and head of the Division of Higher Education at Iowa State University. His research interests encompass the areas of rural education, community college leadership, talent recruitment and retention, and education human resources. He was previously on the faculty at the University of South Carolina and holds a PhD from the University of Wyoming in adult and post-secondary education.
Thank you so much for the introductions. I try to, as much as possible, invite a very diverse group of individuals to come and share their perspectives and experiences. There are several other people that I really, several groups that we didn't get to address. So for example, I invited an expert to speak on educators with disabilities. And by the time she responded, we already had a really large panel, and AERA it was past this, the opportunity for us to add people. But just to show you, inclusion is a really important topic. Is to have all the different voices, and to hear that is really important. We have, as diverse as our panelists, there are still many people that are neglected in these conversations. So to the best extent possible, we will try to highlight different aspects of that, and have follow-up conversations and scholarship that will also address those avenues. So I want to give everybody sort of an idea of how the format's going to be, so everyone knows, like, okay, this is how it's going to work. We're going to have 4 20-minute segments, each of which will be led by a video introduction and presentation. After the video plays, we're going to engage in an informal conversation about the broad topic of focus. For example, we have a video that's going to be about women in higher education leadership. The video will play, and afterwards we'll just talk about it. Like we were sitting around a table and talking about it. I may have questions, as I mentioned, directed to specific individuals. But after that, other people can just feel free to just hop in and say, I have a thought on that, or I disagree with that comment, et cetera, et cetera. So without any further ado, let's begin. We're going to begin with segment 1, Introduction to Talent-Centered Education Leadership and Workforce Inclusion. In the last few decades, fueled by an ethos of accountability and the ubiquity of standardized testing, education reformers have sought to link major HR practices to student test scores. This was seen, for example, in the heavy push for the use of value-added test scores in former teacher evaluations. While these efforts rely on the rhetoric of business comparisons and are commonly known as corporate education reform, many have noted that even these reform efforts are not based on cutting-edge human resource management practices, but rather rely on outdated factory or assembly line approaches. So the role of educators was to serve as an instrument to achieve improvement on student test scores. That is, they are treated as a means to an end. Unfortunately, this has led to the stripping of teacher autonomy, increased workload and pressure, more test-based accountability, which has led to declining interest in the teaching profession as the job was deemed less and less favorable.
Some of the things that I hear constantly is there are so many things to do and to get done in any one day. It is a constant wave beating you down minute by minute, because every day starts out with a to-do list, and before you leave, your to-do list is typically twice as long.
Meanwhile, progressive human resource management and other sectors have increasingly focused on accountability for working conditions, especially in the age of social media, where employees are increasingly vocal about their work lives. As workforce author Jacob Morgan puts it, putting thought and attention towards designing employee experiences where people want to, not just need to come to work. Grounded in this modern approach to talent management and the education working conditions research, I introduced to the field talent-centered education leadership, or TCEL, a new way to think about how to manage the education workforce with an increased emphasis on intentional design of the employee experience to promote employee engagement and support. Critical to TCEL is how talent is interpreted and defined. When we think of talent management, it is most commonly treated as an exclusionary approach that restricts development and support to the chosen few in the organization worthy of being identified as talent. In fact, how education employers have historically defined talent and relatedly how they have defined professionalism often perpetuated inequity for traditionally marginalized groups. For example, these groups are disproportionately affected when workers are criticized or even penalized for being unprofessional by their employers for not dressing in traditional gender-conforming attire or wearing their hairstyles in braids or dreadlocks. From a talent-centered education leadership perspective, it doesn't make any sense because these employees are unfairly facing unfavorable employment responses for factors that have nothing to do with their job performance.
I identify as a gay Jewish man. So I kind of have a very unique, as does everybody else, a unique identity in terms of intersectionality.
I'm very heavily tattooed.
Currently in the school district's discrimination policy, sexual orientation is not listed in all of the characteristics that are protected against discrimination.
They still hold a certain stigma, a certain negative connotation. I constantly wear long sleeves in a position where a lot of teachers wear short sleeves. It's hard for me to show school spirit because most of the school shirts come in short sleeves.
Throughout the day, there are a lot of microaggressions, not just for me, but for a lot of the other teachers that are in marginalized categories as well.
It's also difficult because as I try to further my career and my education, intelligence will be, I feel like, will be monitored as being diminished based off of what they see. I've had more challenges than just because of tattoos. I've had challenges based off of political ideas. I've had challenges based off of my hearing, or loss of hearing, I should say. I'm wearing hearing aids since a child, and so I am not included. I do not feel included.
At the heart of talent-centered education leadership is an emphasis on humanizing the education workspace and responding to employee needs, and that can't be done without acknowledgement and celebration of the increasing diversity of its workforce. Talent-centered education leadership leads with the word talent because equity and excellence are not mutually exclusive.
What I've noticed in my almost 20 years or so in the system is that the further up I am removed from the classroom, I may not see as many females. Same for being a woman of color. I may see some in the classroom, but not a lot in the leadership spaces of the school. And as I move up into the district level and beyond, I'm seeing less and less of myself.
But one barrier that I've seen to be constant in my communications with others who are also working in this space is really kind of deconstructing the frameworks or the foundations of institutional practices that have kept underrepresented population or minority populations from being able to ascend to positions to be able to make the necessary changes. There's often resistance to that because some may not feel that those barriers actually exist and don't fully understand the impact of these barriers and how it has continued to marginalize students of color, continue to marginalize employees of color.
As an African American male, I look around our profession and only 2% of educators are black males, and therefore when you look at who's available to teach or to be a lead teacher or to be an administrator, the pickings are slim.
Another reason why it's important to diversify the workforce is because homogenous faculties lack the empathy and life experience of those who are different, so they're less likely to see microaggressions or flat out oppression or prejudice because it's something that's not in their experience.
How powerful it would be if every child met a teacher along the way who could connect with them, who could understand their lived experiences, and as a result, use that connection to help them grow.
Then we have to ask ourselves, are we really reaping the benefits of diversity, or are we just checking a box to say, hey, we've counted a certain number of people?
While the focus on education working conditions is often on teachers, from a talent-centered education leadership perspective, it is important that we also be intentional about our design of the employee experience and engagement activities for other education staff and employees, including bus drivers, nutrition specialists, and janitors, who are often from marginalized groups and neglected in conversations about improving the education work environment.
Most of the people of color at my school happen to belong to the janitorial staff, which reinforces systemic racism and white supremacy. If we can flip that where students can see that diverse people and people of color can also hold those positions and be equals of teaching and principals and, you know, superintendents and superintendents of curriculum and instruction, and just at all levels of leadership throughout the district, then we kind of flip it to be more equitable and more inclusive of everyone and everything inside our community.
Currently, there is a lot of innovation that's being taken place to address equity, social justice, and other race-related impact on the school system.
One example of this is Richland School District 2's nationally recognized Premier 100 program.
The Premier 100 project is a project that we implemented a couple years ago. This project is centered around our goal of recruiting, developing, and retaining 100 men of color in our classrooms for our students. The data is very clear on the impact of having a man of color in the classroom, particularly an African American male, for our African American students, and how it impacts their education experience throughout their K through 12 educational experience. And so this gives us an opportunity to really hone in on that and address something that is something head on that has a critical impact for the experience of the vast majority of the students that are in our school district. We want to also demonstrate and be a model and show how this work why this work is important and how other districts could replicate our work. So we're looking to provide some sort of framework that we can share with other school districts if they're interested in doing so. And it doesn't just stop with classroom teachers. There are so many more critical areas where we need men of color. We need more male counselors, men of color who are counselors. Another critical area is school psychologists. I think that has an actual direct impact on the number of African American male students who are being identified for special education services, because there's sometimes a cultural disconnect in looking at behaviors and actions and activities of young boys of color.
Like its student-based counterparts, differentiated instruction, TCEL reflects a more equitable approach to talent management by recognizing and acknowledging the importance of diversity and not treating everyone as having the same needs and motivation. The approach goes beyond addressing issues of diversity of representation by maintaining a work environment that cultivates a sense of belonging for all employees. This is highly relevant in the modern day context as younger generation of workers are increasingly looking for more diverse and inclusive workspaces. Unfortunately, we still have a long way to go. I'm sorry that the video was a little long, but so basically I asked people to share their insights and their perspectives, and people sent me half-an-hour videos and whatnot. And it was really hard to cut out because it was so much great stuff. They were bearing their souls, you know, to share how they felt discriminated against and all the things. So I said, okay, well, let's get it down to this. Let's get it to, so me and Zach were just working to say, I don't think that we can cut anymore without taking away from their voice. So I apologize a little bit about that, but I do wanted to get your thoughts and initial reactions about just anything broadly about the contest or anything any particular speaker said that may have resonated with you. And then we'll just open the floor up for now.
For me, Henry, I resonated with the superintendent as he was discussing the importance and the need for an increased number of African American males in the workforce in his school district and the initiatives that he's taken on to make that happen. Because it directly ties into the work that I'm currently doing with Atlanta Public Schools, with gaps that we have in leadership as it relates to African American males not matriculating through our pipeline in a way that's going to allow them to be future leaders in our district. Right now, our numbers are very low in that regard. And I think at some point during the conversation, I'll get a chance to speak about our numbers in the district as it relates to African American males coming through our leadership development pipeline and also matriculating to the principalship.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any comments to kind of tag on that? Yeah, Susie.
May I add, because Dr. Hunter, you're just next door to us in Georgia, and I find it interesting because you said African American males. The Premier 100 started out as the African American males, but the problem Dr. Davis is finding is that he's not getting any Hispanic males. He's not getting any, and so one of the things they used to do prior to the pandemic was they actually went to Puerto Rico to recruit people. But he goes, I don't even have the pool in my teaching, let alone for them to be assistant principals, and then on up. And so that's something that we're working on to see because his district is almost 25%, I think, Hispanic, but yet the teacher representation of that. So he's very cognizant and there's a lot more to be done. So I didn't know if you had a similar situation in the Hispanic realm too, or just other people of color other than just Black.
Yes, we do. Actually, we're actually applying for a grant that encompasses both Latino and African American males in terms of increasing their interests. But we too have that issue with the Latino teachers as well as Latinos in leadership. I would say in my development program, I've been doing it for 4 years, and I've only had one Latino. This year was the first time I had a Latino person interested in leadership. And I don't know of many Latino teachers in our district as well.
Thank you. I do have a question. So we know about the challenges with diversity and inclusion. And Michelle, Michelle's your hand's up. Okay, Michelle, please.
I was just going to add that one of the things that resonated was the notion of the pipeline. So these very specific initiatives to increase the diversity of the pipeline is absolutely essential, and it has to be thinking about career changers coming into education. It has to be looking at the robustness of the teacher pipeline and how we actually bring more young people into the teaching profession, even with the challenges that were in your video, Henry. But then the other piece of it, which I think your TCEL gets to, is how do you actually keep folks in the teaching and in the leadership profession when the challenges continue to mount, the resources continue to be more scarce. And so I think it's like a both and. We need to build the pipeline, and we need to figure out how to create that kind of human-centered organizational caring and nurturing for people so that they will stay in the profession.
That's a really good point, Michelle. And that relates to the question I was going to ask. Are there any evidence-based interventions that are linked with improvement in workplace inclusion? And I open this up for everyone. Like, is there anything that we know from the research that actually works?
I mean, I'll start off. I would say that at least from my research on trans educators, the overwhelming evidence that I found pointed to the importance of planning up front, that the more people met with administrators and developed a plan for whatever might come down the road, whether it be, you know, concerns by parents, community members, whatever it is, the more that that people could get together ahead of time, because the real problems for trans educators was when they felt that they were sort of like chasing after the train. You know, that there was one person in my study that all of a sudden she looked out the window and the TV truck was there, and it turned out it was there for her, and she didn't know about it. And those kind of blindsiding opportunities, those are the things that really were so emotionally and mentally difficult for people. So I would, if I had to point to one, it's really getting together with your administrator or superintendent and planning it out up front.
Thank you.
I could follow up on that. I recently had the opportunity to work with a colleague, and we conducted a case study of a teacher's gender transition over a 2-year period. And exactly what Michelle just said was one of the major findings of our study, in that the superintendent and the principal, where the teacher was working, were very proactive in thinking about, okay, what is the message? What is the messaging that will go out or won't go out? And they communicated with the teacher on every step, trying to figure out exactly what she wanted and how she wanted to be treated, what she wanted to be called, and then making sure they planned ahead of time for any of those parent concerns or challenges or things that would come across their desks or phone calls that they would get, you know, not having news trucks show up outside the school unannounced.
Thank you. Tiffany, in your work, you often recommend promoting inclusion to combat homophobia and transphobia, sort of inclusion training. Has there been any evidence-based training that have been found to lead to more inclusion as well?
Not a whole lot. It's mostly folks doing their own inclusion training, to maybe working with teachers' unions. Sometimes they help out with that. Some of them have toolkits. GLSEN, of course, has their Safe Space Kit. And their Safe Space Kit not only is worthwhile in promoting inclusion in schools for students, but it's also the same techniques work for grown-ups. I mean, when our school leaders recognize people for who they are and treat, you know, your LGBTQ plus population just like they would treat others, treating them like humans, then we all follow through with that. And also bringing that training, that professional development to staff around those issues, and also including, you know, how we treat the grown-ups in our buildings in addition to the kids.
I read some work that's interesting that talked about how sometimes diversity training can backfire, and it actually makes people more resentful of diversity efforts, and that actually a better way to do it is to have them just work side by side and get to know each other. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Do you think that diversity training could potentially backfire? People feel like they're just being shoved down their throat. Any thoughts on that?
You know, I think part of it is how it's done. You know, I think oftentimes what we read are kind of broad brush strokes of that are frequently cherry picking in terms of the findings that they're looking for. So I find those results of that work a bit dubious, because I know that in education research, it's showed that if you are engaging folks authentically, particularly in self-examinations, such as racial autobiographies, that it can be a really powerful learning experience, but it's also about even how that is done. So I think it's the kind of the devil's in the details in that regard. Though I will say that, you know, a lot of adult learning shows that the opportunity to actually work with someone, whether or not they are innovating on a new teaching practice, or you are working with a person that's very different from yourself, that ability to have that personal experience does make a huge difference. So I wouldn't say it's either or, I would say it's both, and making sure that it's a high quality experience.
So Katie, that's that improvement science. The devil is in the detail, how it's actually implemented. It looks like we're going to have to segue to segment 2. So thank you. Inadequate funding and poor working conditions have heavily contributed to nationwide. I think this is the same video. Shortages that have intensified in recent years. In my home state of South Carolina, we've been seeing escalating teacher turnover and declining teacher education enrollment.
As a whole in education, we don't do a very good job of retaining talent in any demographic category. Teachers stay in education usually because of their commitment, because of their passion, because of their dedication to children. Very rarely is it because of what we do to actively retain them. And that's a problem.
Beyond substantive improvement in teacher compensation, research has repeatedly found a positive relationship between administrative support and teacher retention. Consequently, my colleagues and I conducted a study to better understand teachers' perception of the relative importance of different types of administrative support for teacher retention. These supports were frequently identified in the research as important. What we found across schools of varying geographic context, degree of teacher staffing challenges, and grade level was that respect was consistently identified as the most important factor for teachers in their intention to turnover.
We had the opportunity to talk from and learn from both teachers and school leaders. The interviewees were not surprised at all to see that respect was the highest ranked attribute from our quantitative results.
Respect means valuing others despite our differences or personal grievances. It means treating teachers as the professionals that they are and not trying to micromanage or nitpick them, but rather allowing them the autonomy to do what they know is best for each and every student in their classroom. It means keeping an open flow of communication, and it means valuing our differences in a way that's accepting and inclusive of all cultures and races and genders.
Teachers spend a lot of time and energy and effort into building relationships with their students so that they feel valued and seen and appreciated, not just as people who are learning in our classes, but in individuals and as in who they are. And I think admin can show respect to their teachers in the exact same way.
The respect piece really comes in to actually listening to what their staff has to say and helping them in the implementation process of new ideas, and not just asking for those ideas, but actually following through with some of the ideas that teachers bring to the table. Too many times, staff feel that their voices don't matter after being at the table and their views being overlooked. In terms of pushback on community disrespect towards teachers, I would love to see my personal administration more outspoken about it, or district leaders more outspoken about it.
So then when I think about what respect looks like when it's present in a school, that's making respect tangible. You would have open dialogue, high standards, professionalism.
Ways that administrators can humanize and show respect in the workplace is by making it an inclusive workplace. They could offer opportunities for constructive feedback and allow opinions to be included in all the decisions that are made that affect the stakeholders directly. This could be the students, community, and the teachers.
Our admin does a fantastic job of this. They're in our classes, they're building relationships with their faculty and their staff. They're sharing in our wins in staff meetings and letters, and they're reminding us that they are alongside us in the trenches through the highs and the lows. That is an incredibly powerful demonstration of respect, and instead of just sending us an email that says, hey, I respect and value you as people, they're right there with us.
We have to really accept the notion of safe spaces and brave spaces. We have to be deliberate in creating channels for safe spaces. With these brave spaces, what we have to rely upon is for the leaders in those groups, the leaders in those circles, to make active efforts to include the voices of those team members. ensure that you share the space with them. Intentionally give them the mic to share what their ideas are. Then to validate what those ideas are in these settings by acknowledging the worth of what they've contributed. By doing that, the person who holds the power, the person who benefits from the structures that are in place, they are demonstrating bravery because they're looking at this setting, they're realizing that there are going to possibly be opportunities where this team member is not going to be included, and they're going to be very purposeful in making sure that their voice is heard.
Humanizing the education workplace has always been important, but even more so during the COVID pandemic, where numerous educators were literally losing their lives and so many others stressed beyond imagination, especially at the pandemic's onset, where they were expected to continue to show up to work at a time when the state was demanding people across most sectors stay home. By showing up daily, most educators felt they were not only putting themselves and their students at risk, but also their own families, including children and the elderly, which they had to go home to each and every day. The pandemic also changed the way most classrooms operated, which, along with its emotional toll, resulted in education employees requiring new levels of differentiated support.
I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Tran and Dr. Cunningham on looking at talent-centered educational leadership during the pandemic. And a leader that had the talent-centered leadership focus started to focus on the faculty, on the staff. What are their needs? Are the teachers getting what they need to meet the students' needs? Oftentimes they would have meetings for the faculty and staff to share what they see that are needs going on. One of the pieces that was brought to the attention of the leadership was that students couldn't actually make it to school to pick up food. So what ended up happening is the school then ended up taking the food to the community. So we have to think of things differently, but the communication had to be two directions. Another aspect that is so important is to remember that they are professionals. None of us have gone through a pandemic before, so those who had the talent-centered focus gave grace. The one superintendent said, hey, you never did this before. If you messed up today, tomorrow's a new day, we'll learn something better. That helped the teachers to know, hey, they know I'm trying, and to give them support. I really hope that all of you embrace the talent-centered leadership and see how that makes such a difference for your working staff.
Thank you. The respect piece consistently showed up in research I've done, whether I'm talking to prospective educators, college students, and why they don't want to enter the education profession. They talked about the idea of the profession lacking respect, and that if I were to take that position, I would be letting down my family. Like you could have done so much more than be a teacher. Why did you choose this profession? And so it's not the money, it was really that, but the money is correlated with that, right? Because the fact that there's a lack of respect is related to the fact that the compensation is low. And then when I talked to current educators, it was the same thing. The lack of respect consistently showed as the number one reason, the number one support that they were looking for in terms of administrative support. And then when I spoke to people from different backgrounds, I looked into like, what does the nuance of respect look like for different marginalized populations? And whether or not, so this is the thing I'm thinking about, maybe you guys can help with this. Does respect look the same for everyone? Or does respect look different for different groups? Is respect a universal thing? So I just want to open up the floor for you all to think about that. Thank you.
I can start with something.
Okay.
So I really liked the comment that was made in the video. A woman said, make respect tangible. And I think there are lots of ways in which we could do this. And it kind of connects back to what you asked me earlier, Henry, around some, research-based ideas that help with homophobia and transphobia specifically. And really, one way to make respect tangible is to have policies in place that allow folks to understand that they are protected and valued. And so I think that's one way that respect can be tangible. And to answer another sort of question you asked, yes, I think respect might look different for different groups of individuals. But what it takes is walking alongside folks that is what you're calling your talent, and finding out what it is that they specifically need to feel respected.
Thank you, Tiffany. Does anybody else have any? Mario, yes.
I'd love to speak a little bit on that. I was a high school math teacher before I became a researcher in Austin, Texas, and I came out as trans my second year of teaching. And so in that scenario with that very first principal that I had, it was, everything went wrong, basically. I mean, he wanted basically to fire me without telling me that he wanted me to fire me, right? And so as is, the nature of principals in a lot of, lower SES Title I schools, we switched to a new principal then that next summer. And the next principal, basically, I came out to him again, and he was the complete opposite, lo and behold, right? I mean, he basically told me, like, do whatever you need to do, be Mr. Suarez, from now on. If you have any problems with, parents or teachers, I will deal with it, basically. And ever since that day, I stayed teaching for about 7 years afterwards, until I started my PhD program. And so, like Tiffany said, I mean, respect does look different in different scenarios. And so I think first is that we need to understand that we need to value individuals as a society, right? And so if we see that trans people are people, right, and that we're deserving of happiness on and off our work lives, like, that's crucial for us, and we need to be able to support those that are most vulnerable in their schools. Just to piggyback a little bit on that evidence-based part, I'm lucky to be working with some amazing colleagues and friends, Harper Keenan at University of British Columbia and Molly McQuillan at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we're working on what we think is going to be one of the first large-scale studies of trans educators in the US and Canada. And we have some amazing graduate research assistants as well. We just finished data collection, and we have just over 300 or so trans identified individuals. That includes gender nonconforming and non-binary folks as well, from that are all identified as trans workers. So that also includes custodians, librarians, principals, administrators in there. And so we just finished the first step, the data collection process, and we're hoping we're in preliminary data analysis right now. And so we're hoping to report out on some of the findings that we get from different contexts. And one of the things that we're finding is that there's a huge range of experiences that vary, one could imagine, by location, whether they live in rural, urban, school districts, by state, because we don't have yet any kind of national or federal employment non-discrimination policy, right? They vary widely, but then we're also seeing that there's immense amount of supports in different pockets. And so we're hoping that it'll be turn into a mixed method study where we can look and do intense qualitative case studies with some of the folks in areas where they are thriving, and why, what's happening, what can we tell and what can we learn from what's happening in those school districts.
Thank you. Michelle Dow, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Dr. Suarez said, because I think it's so true that the experiences of trans educators from my research is that we're not a monolithic group. That myself as a trans woman in Boston will have a different experience from one of the people I studied who is a trans woman in Fresno, California. I found it to be very geographic specific. And by the same terms, I mean, a Black trans woman in the inner city of Boston, and I'm living in Cambridge, a very nice community, we're going to have completely different experiences. So I think that concept of intersectionality really is so important, probably not just for trans people, but for all marginalized communities, that our experiences are very different depending on the combination of both privilege and lack of privilege that we have.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that, Henry? I was just thinking that, a lot of the research that focuses on teacher turnover, to all of the points that you all have made, really does focus on teachers pointing to their relationship with their principal and whether or not it's a good relationship or not a good relationship. I wasn't aware of the specifics with regard to respect, but it does, if you think about it in terms of that human-centered approach, I think it makes a lot of sense that there would be no one-size-fits-all meaning for respect, just as there's probably no one-size-fits-all in terms of what it means to have a good relationship with your principal, like what I'm expecting from my supervisor. Me is probably different from other people within this Zoom room even. And yet, how we prepare principals generally is with very similar texts and very similar practices. And so it raises the question, are we doing a disservice to our students and undermining this goal that we're talking about of teacher retention and also wanting to make the leadership pipeline an appealing career path?
Thank you, Michelle. That rings so true. I was talking to Dr. Cunningham's husband, and we were talking about, what is it that we need from support from our leaders? And we had talked about, you don't need to ask us about our day, our family. We don't care about any of that. Give us the resources to do our job. Whereas Dr. Hardy, for example, let's meet together on a Saturday and get to know each other's family. And that was really important to her. So, I mean, those type of supports are just very different. I did want to go back to a little bit on Mario's comment. And a little bit to what Michelle Dow was talking about. If school leaders are a pivotal point in that support aspect, how should school leaders deal with homophobic parents and communities to best support their LGBT educators? So, for example, a parent who complains for religious reasons about their children being in their respondent's class, or a coach in the locker room, for example, how do they navigate that? Because I'm thinking about this from a perspective as an employer, right? The principal is like the middle manager. They're in between, so the teacher, and then they're also the community, and then they have their boss in the district. How does that work? How do they best support their employees? Thanks.
Thanks for that question. And then I'll talk about it anecdotally, just because I haven't come across research-based any studies or anything. But with the first principal, basically, he was afraid. The reason he told me that he wanted me to quote unquote transfer to a different school was because he was afraid that parents, teachers would come and tell them that I had some sort of quote unquote agenda on that I was teaching their kids. And the second principal, the one that I was the most loyal to, that was completely different. He basically said he's like, all he did was tell them that if parents came up to him or other folks came up to him, he just told them, like, I'm not teaching anything other than math. Like, literally, that was my whole agenda. I'm like, I'm just teaching your students math, and I want them to pass. And really, I mean, that's all he did, and that appeased the few parents that came up to him.
Thank you.
Oh, I'd like to add something to that. I think, Henry, I think that question is bigger than the individual school, because if you leave that up to the school, like Mario said, every time a new principal comes in, it's going to be a different perspective. That's a board of education decision. That's a policy that needs to come from the top. So no matter what school a person is or what community a parent is from, they already know what the board's belief is, what the community's belief is about inclusion and diversity. So they're not going to go to different schools, or you're not going to have to worry about a different principal or a different leader or what their perspective or angle is, because the district has set a policy.
But what if the board is an exclusive board? So I'm just thinking about like certain communities where they're just very anti, for example. Do I, as a school principal, just, I go with what the boss says, and if I don't like it, I vote with my feet and go somewhere else? Or do I work as an agent of change within this school? Do you know what I'm saying? I'm really thinking about this as a principal, like I'm caught, right? Any thoughts on that?
I was going to jump in. Part is I'm hoping that we do, in our preparation programs, work on creating students who are going to be agents of change. I don't know how many of you have been principals in this group, but no matter what, there are certain things when the school board changes, pressures change, when maybe a different business comes in that impacts how your school gets run. So there's times that people move for different reasons, and I think it's imperative, no matter what, to stay true to who you are and your beliefs. And that's why from our very beginning, our preparation, the very first class, the students have to reflect on what are their own biases, what are their own prejudices, and that goes all the way through to the day that they graduate. Now, we can't make them all believe what we want them all to believe, but if they went through our program, they definitely got this. And it's something like I tell my students is, if I'm going to give you a reference, you need to represent us well. And that means that you are embodying the goals and the values that we have. So
thank you, Susie. Now we're moving into our next section. I like to be timely, so we have this all scheduled out. All right, David.
In 2017, the American Council on Education reported that women hold a mere 30% of all college presidencies, including traditional universities and community colleges. While this represents a 4% increase for women overall since the 2012 report, women of color only represent a dismal 5% of all college presidents today. As the student population of higher education continues to diversify, the absence of women leaders, particularly women of color leaders, presents an existential dilemma for faculty and students alike. The 2017 ACE report highlights the percentage of women of color college presidents experience zero growth, and expectations of achieved parity are estimated at the year 2050. What then can we do to broaden the leadership pathways, placements, and retention practices for women of color in academia over the next 30 years or less? Drawing upon social exchange theory to understand the leadership trajectory of women of color, these studies have highlighted their attitudes and motivations to explain their executive leadership career choices in academia. Current research elevating the experiences of women of color leaders have shown us that the most effective way to achieve a diverse talent pool, hiring committee, composition of finalists for top leadership positions, and an unbiased hiring process is to acknowledge the white male privilege permeating higher education. We must also mitigate the legacies of racism and sexism historically embedded in all institutions and deride the everyday ways in which the oppressive nature of white privilege manifests itself. This begins with a talent-centered approach and praxis that moves us beyond the performative diversity-driven HR practices of the past decades. Countering white male dominance within academic leadership is central to reversing the disproportionality of women leaders. Scholars and practitioners must embrace a critical approach to talent development and talent management. This involves the active pipeline and recruiting and retention practices. Taking a talent-centered approach to leadership development calls for us to interrogate and reframe the infrastructure designed for the dominant archetype. Furthermore, hiring authorities must actively examine the intersections of race and gender and the ways in which these communities of faculty are marginalized along the executive leadership journey. Engaging in equitable talent-centered HR praxis translates to equitable succession planning, institutionalized recruitment and retention strategies and practices, building intergenerational networks, and fostering communities of practice on leadership development. The antithesis to the Old Boys Network is the web of Black women paving the way and paying it forward for future leaders of color. The resilience and resistance embodied by women of color leaders against the white supremacist system within which we deem higher education speaks truth to their lived experiences. When faced with isolation or outright resistance, women of color leaders establish formal and informal leadership communities or networks to sustain themselves. This resiliency, demonstrated through emotional intelligence, authenticity, and agility, is rooted in our transnational heritage and the ancestral lands upon which many of our colleges and universities sit. Yet, as Bell Hooks reminds us, endurance is not the same as transformation. As women continue to lead in statistical categories like student population and degree attainment, we are well positioned to transform the academic landscape by transforming the leadership archetype. The institutional benefits of women of color leaders in education ripples in triplicate to present and future students, faculty, and staff. Furthermore, women of color leaders can serve as transformative forces that help create anti-racist organizations by looking at the systemic challenges in addressing bias, prejudices, and privilege. The just outcomes entail leveling the playing field and shifting the influential power and decision-making structure of and within higher education. The evolution of Black women's radical leadership will not be televised, but it will lead to more just and equitable educational institutions. We are the future leaders of the Academy.
So I noticed that my higher ed folks have been a little quiet because the earlier conversation has been heavily K-12. So now we're going to pivot over to the higher ed side. And Dr. Gauze is actually interested in the faculty career. So I thought this was a great opportunity to spotlight Dr. Gauze and give her an opportunity to kind of take the helm here. And I'll pass the mic to you, Dr. Gauze.
Thank you, Dr. Tran. So my research so far has covered that we have to look beyond representation as we talk about diversity and equity. It's not just about increasing the numbers, right? We have that approach, but we have to look at the overt and covert ways in which the definition of talent shifts once we introduce race and gender. The other thing that my research has uncovered is that a human-centered approach to those that are successful in attaining leadership positions, specifically women of color, is very rooted in having access to coaches and mentors that support their ambition. So in essence, we have to be able to disrupt the discourse around the pathways to leadership in higher education. We also have to disrupt the discourse on what a leader looks like in higher education. So it's not just a pipeline issue, that there are other factors at play, including gendered organizations, apprehension to lead because of the political and charged climate around securing such a high level position, and the isolation that perhaps will come with it when you don't have others that look like you that you can lean on.
Thank you. There's the kids in the background. Thanks. Bridget, I had a quick question. This is related to Dr. Gauze, her content area. In your work, you talk about racialized and gendered experiences that impact women faculty of color. How do those experiences impact women differently than other women, the women of color differently than other women, or male faculty of color, for example? And what can organizations do to counter these experiences?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Gauze, for the video and your scholarship. I'm a mother too, so I was listening more to the K-12 educators from a different lens than my research on women faculty. I think in terms of women of color, first, I don't do comparative work, so I don't necessarily say here's men and here's women and these are the differences. Instead, I try to center women and center their experiences, and really doing a new book on mentoring where we got 80 people who sent in their abstracts wanting to be in this book on how Black women are mentoring other Black women, because it's just high time in 2021 that we cannot wait on institutions to set up equitable mentoring systems and even have people who are capable in terms of culturally competent, socially just, to mentor women, particularly Black women, in the ways that Dr. Gauze laid out in the video. So I think some of the ways that uniquely show up for women, for women of color, is you don't really know. Is someone telling me that, as I sit in a lounge that I should leave, this is just for faculty? Is it because I look young? Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm a woman of color? It depends. When I've worked in Vermont, we were talking about geographics earlier, from where I work now, at the University of Maryland, where I have 9 other Black women faculty in my department for the first time in a 20-year career. So I think that's one of the things, is that you spend a lot of emotional and physical labor trying to figure out which of my intersecting identities is this impacting me, and then it takes away from the opportunities. I also think we need to call out men of color and how the system of patriarchy that they've benefited from also has some embedded, biases and prejudices that same as white women face from white men, that we're not seen as competent, we're not seen as credible, and that carries over to students, that carries over to administrators. And so what I've been centering and focusing on then is just how can we support each other, and even within that, trying to make sure that we're coming from operating, seeing each other as respectful and not internalizing some of that racialized genderism that's been put on us. And it's been really exciting to draw from these women of color, trans and cisgender women who've created, Black Lives Matter, who've really been at the forefront of some of these movements, Say Her Name, Breonna Taylor, and even how that situation got played out with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, in terms of we're now in a trial, right, with George Floyd, and where's Breonna Taylor's trial? So that's just my initial thoughts in terms of really trying to move away from comparisons and really just centering what the experiences are.
Thank you. Does anybody want to add to that? Right. Well, I have a question for you, Michelle Young. In your research, you note that less attention has been given to macro level policies and practices that shape women's career choices and working conditions. In what ways have recent educational policies enactments negatively affected women's experiences in the workplace?
Well, I think you can take a look at this just in terms of how the fact that the majority of the educator workforce is female. And since the 1980s, there's been a significant decline or dismantling of a lot of policies, whether that's focused on children or on social welfare, that have had a direct impact on women. And this has been the case specifically also within the education field, too, where you've got a tendency to move towards kind of dismantling job stability. You have authority in the classroom reducing, you have authority of the principalship reducing. And a lot of this is tied towards neoliberal reforms, which are using, as you pointed out in your introductory video, kind of a discourse of efficiency and effectiveness and so forth. Those are having a huge impact on the educator workforce, which is predominantly female. And I think that that's a really important thing to say. And it doesn't typically get said. We sort of like talk about generic educators rather than thinking about who the bodies are that are actually in these educators. I think that this also has a really significant impact on women because of the rationale that women have for entering the educator workforce and how these policies have impacted what education looks like in the classroom, as well as what education leadership looks like because of these policies. So if we just take race to the top, which you also mentioned, Henry, in the late 80s, we saw this kind of shift toward instructional leadership and towards collaborative leadership, towards this notion of the collective, of kind of human-centered. And then came No Child Left Behind, and then came Race to the Top, and some other kind of neoliberal sort of anti-educator policies that redirected ed leadership as a more managerial, as a supervisory, as kind of a thumb on the head of teachers, making sure they do the right thing. You saw a general discourse moving in the direction of, we must fire bad teachers, rather than thinking about teachers as people who are learning throughout their entire career trajectory. So at this same moment, we saw a shift where more women were moving into leadership positions. That has kind of faltered. Particularly at the superintendency level. We were seeing increases in the number of women superintendents. Right now, at the current trajectory, it would take 30 years for women to be at the same number of as men in terms of the percentage of superintendents that are men versus women. So I think that there are these larger policy trends that we kind of think as having no gender or having no race. And yet they are explicitly impacting more and more women and more women of color. Here's a good example of that. The very districts that are most impacted by these accountability policies and policies like Race to the Top, which create the kind of a competitive nature among schools, that's where women and women of color tend to be going for their superintendencies, tend to be going for their high school level leadership positions. And those are the places where we're finding schools being taken over by the state. We're finding those schools being placed on accountability watch lists and so forth. So it's it is a really troubling trend, actually, where we're beginning to see a shift in like what counts as leadership, moving towards more notions of collaborative and instructional and curriculum focus. And now they've shifted away from that to where it's much more about accountability and testing and moving the needle and that sort of thing.
Oh, thank you, Sharon, for that comment. Simone, remember when so Dr. Gauss and I went to a poorer region of our state, and we were having a meeting with some superintendents, and we're like, oh, we talked about, women in leadership, and we said, hey, there are women of color leadership here. And Dr. Gauss pointed to me, and she said, you notice though, they're all concentrated in this area of the state and the poorer areas of the state. When there was the wealthier districts or whatnot, who are the superintendents there? And so that just kind of reminded me of what you just mentioned earlier about like who are, when the women of leaders take leadership, what districts are they leading? And that has nuance in terms of progress and evolution as well. Thank you so much. Dr. Cunningham, I have a question for you. So you're an expert on education leadership preparation. Education administrative programs tend to center their programming on traditional leadership theories, which legitimizes male behaviors and delegitimizes women's behaviors. So the same could be said about workplace policy and culture. What can our education leaders in both K-12 and higher ed do to reach more women, to attract them into leadership roles and create environments where women feel welcomed, feel valued, and included?
Ooh. That's a big question. That's a big question.
I like to hit you with the hard questions.
Yeah, one of the things that has been coming back, and it's probably from the work that we've done, Henry, and some of the collaborative work that I've been able to do with Michelle Young, is this notion of humanizing and recognizing the humans that are part of the job, right? It's that respect. If that is something that is forefronted, that notion of respect, and we found that in our study, seemed to be the catalyst to get to some of the other supportive structures. So if we have a system, and we also have to take a look at the system that we are currently operating in to make shifts where necessary, and have the humility, I think, as where our positions are, to be able to leverage and push on our own edges of growth, to see how can we make some changes within it. Now there's some other power dynamics that we'd have to be considering as we go through, but to be able to develop strong relationships, I think there's an opportunity for higher education in K-12 to have some strong relationships in order for those partnerships to help have a collective conversation, right? We talked before about the pipeline, and if the pipeline can't start there's a whole system involved. And I'm wondering if a partnership could allow for opportunities to critically look at our system and also invite more participation from different groups of people that are traditionally left out, marginalized, not invited to the table, and whose voices, the folks that have voices but are not often allowed to be heard. So we have to look at that as a profession. Who's not at the table, and why are they not at the table? How can we get them to the table?
Thank you so much, Dr. Cunningham. Does anybody have any final comments about this section before we kind of transition to the next? Thank you.
Among those in a full-time faculty position, only approximately 25% are faculty of color, and only approximately 5% are Black faculty. Most graduate students contend with imposter syndrome and feelings of isolation. But these experiences for students of color are exacerbated due to the lack of representation, not just within the knowledge field, but among the faculty as well. I cannot emphasize enough the impact that faculty of color, particularly Black faculty members, have had in the lives of myself and my peers.
When I first started graduate school, I came into contact with a professor by the name of Dr. Richard Reddick. And he was working on a research project, and asked me if I would be willing to work alongside him and some of his colleagues on that research project. And in engaging in this project, it was one of the first times that I really felt like I belonged. I felt like I was a graduate student. I felt like I belonged in the academy. I felt like I was capable of doing the work. Shortly thereafter, I came across Dr. Mark Gooden, who eventually became my dissertation chair, as well as one of my mentors, and still serves as my mentor to this day. And he was one of the ones who talked to me about considering becoming a faculty member, and eventually convinced me that I was capable of becoming one. Before then, I didn't really see myself as a faculty member, didn't think I had the ability to be a faculty member. They helped me to realize that that I had, what it took. I just needed some development, and they took out the time to help develop me. But not only that, they linked me into some networks to where I saw other folks who looked like me, other folks who were striving to achieve the same types of things that I was trying to achieve. And just being a part of that network, being surrounded by them, being affirmed by them, really made a huge impact on my career trajectory. And as I mentioned, after being a part of that network, after having those conversations, after being in those research meetings, really gave me the confidence as well as the skills that I needed in order to go into the academy.
Because when you start to have self-doubt, it's helpful to see someone who looks like you that has made it on the other side. Engaging with diverse faculty members also means engaging in diverse theoretical ideologies, frameworks, and applications.
Additionally, for students who do not identify as a person of color, exposure to a diverse thought process, teaching methodology, and research by a Black professor could open up a whole new way of seeing the world. From Frederick Douglass to Booker T. Washington to Anna Julia Cooper, the knowledge production alone by Black faculty has laid a rich foundation for the future of academia.
To better understand the lack of diversity of engineering faculty at top research or Carnegie classified R1 institutions, part of the work of our National Science Foundation funded research is to examine tenure or tenure track engineering faculty's perception of diversity climate across ethnic groups and their turnover intentions. To accomplish this, we conducted a national survey of our target population, and our preliminary results have suggested several interesting findings. Based on over 700 responses, we found differences in how men and women faculty perceive their institution's inclusive practices, with male faculty typically expressing a more positive perception than females. Black and Hispanic faculty were also more likely to feel less organizational inclusion and correspondingly have a less positive perception of the institution's inclusive practices than their white counterparts. From a broader perspective, we found that faculty who felt that their employer had a lower value of diversity were more likely to indicate they were considering leaving the organization.
From our respondent feedback regarding diversity concerns in their department or subject specialty, some thematic patterns have emerged. One major theme is noting the pipeline problem, which some respondents used to explain away their diversity challenges with a perceived incompatibility with the subject matter and people of color. For example, one person shared,
but it could very well be that what is emphasized, valued, and promoted reinforces a lack of diversity. So for example, researchers suggest that STEM faculty often want to emphasize the technical aspects of the industry, while Black students are often more interested in issues of social justice, such as how to use those technical skills to advance social change for the disenfranchised. But this is often not valued or promoted by the institution. Furthermore, the lack of faculty of color often results in fewer mentors that students of colors feel they can relate to, see as role models, or receive what they need in terms of support from. These type of occurrences result in statistics such as And while that leads to a recruitment issue for engineering faculty of color, it also has strong roots in retention issue for students of color in academia. This has been demonstrated by research that has shown that similarly qualified and prepared Black, Hispanic, and white students, in those situations, those students of color are more likely to transition out of STEM and drop out altogether than their white counterparts.
In our study that focused on how inclusive engineering faculty workspaces are, there are many who describe feeling excluded from their work environments because of their race and gender. For example, one participant shared, Another person shared, clearly, workplace inclusion is an area that warrants more attention.
So I just put this in the chat box. It was 700 at the time we shot that video. It's like up to 1,161 faculty now. We've talked to STEM faculty all across R1 institutions, and we've received really polarizing responses. There are some who went into detail about the nuanced challenges they received and the discrimination that they felt existed in the academy, specifically in the STEM fields. And then there was another group of people who felt like, no, there are no challenges. This is called rigor. Right? It's called, it's called doing your job. And if you do good, then you move up and you excel. And if you don't do good, you get kicked out of the academy. That's how it is. That's just, you know what I'm saying? That's how the industry is designed. And you can't cut it, then you can't cut it. There's no discrimination happening. And so we and then there were some people who were very hostile, and we also got the other side of it, which was like, if anyone's being discriminated, it's who you are saying are the heteronormative straight white males are being discriminated, right? Because we're not getting the benefit of your diversity program. We're not. So it was really polarizing. We haven't gone through all the data yet, but Dr. Platt and I are just sitting there like, wow, we have tons here. We just want to show you some of the clips. Oh, there's a question and a comment from from attendee. I wonder if the feelings are the same in HBCUs that have STEM engineering programs. Does anybody know the answer to that? Whether or not HBCU STEM faculty or STEM participants have that same feeling, or if it's completely different because of the nature of HBCUs?
The only research I've done on STEM, on HBCU experiences has shown that very different perspectives, that people of color, surprise, feel like it's a home environment, feel very valued and appreciated. What I have found recently is I've been trying to secure a grant for another project, is that STEM faculty at HBCUs are often left out of receiving some of these big NSF grants because they don't have the infrastructure that a lot of the R1 institutions that you're looking at have. And so it's just, further marginalizing them and not being able to get research on HBCUs because of their not racking up in terms of the cadre and caliber, like you were talking about, the rigor that people do not see, or they don't have the lab space or the resources to secure some of the NSF grants. And so unfortunately, that's a big area where we're lacking data.
I find that to be such an entrenched problem in academia, because we do so much research talking about equity and creating opportunities for people, and yet the industry itself is so discriminatory in terms of like, okay, well, if you're not in this privileged group, we're not going to talk to you. Who is your pedigree? Where did you get your doctoral degree from? Are we? And I've seen this play out in job searches and just all sorts of things where like, yeah, but this person came from this institution. I'm like, what does it matter? Look at their publication record. Look at their scholarship. You're like, yeah, but that's that's R3, or whatnot. And I have a question for you, Gregory. Given your experience in the role, how important do you feel diversity and inclusion professionals are for improving equity and diversity in the workforce? And I ask you this, and then I open it for everybody as well. This is important because many people wonder if D&I professionals can actually make a difference given the pervasive systematic biases that are built into the structure and policy of institutions. That is, what restraints and opportunities do they have? Do they have any teeth to make change?
So two quick things. My name is Gregory Vincent, but it works all the time. It's so good to connect with former colleagues like Michelle Young and Spencer Platt and the UT gang. So it's great to be able to connect. I want to respond very quickly to that earlier question. I think that there are some positive results that are coming as a result of the expansion of doctoral programs at historically Black colleges, particularly public historically Black college. I'm thinking particularly about North Carolina A&T and Florida A&M. And with the desegregation settlement, I see schools like Morgan State and others growing their doctoral programs. So I do see a real opportunity. We've seen some promising results at the undergraduate level in the production of STEM majors, and I think there'll be more of that to come. It will take some time. There is no one person, to answer the direct question, who can address DEI alone, and that includes the president. It takes a collective effort from the entire community. And that's one of the reasons why, regardless of gender or race, every leader has to be able to demonstrate a commitment to DEI. That should be a deal breaker, just like financial management, just like the ability to raise money. Everyone from director, dean, and above should have a demonstrated portfolio about how they've effectively addressed diversity. At the University of Texas, one of the things that we did over a period of time was really two levels, and you heard from two of the students who directly benefited from that. Is we had a thematic faculty hiring program where we hired 70 faculty of color in a variety of fields, including STEM. And what we did was we emphasized those areas of study that were underrepresented in the curriculum. And so what was effective about that is that we didn't focus on the race or gender of the faculty candidates, but we focused on the research area. Likewise, we did that for graduate students, doctoral students, and Drs. Platt, and you heard from Dr. Spike, benefited from that support. Which leads me to my last point. You know, we had some breakthroughs, particularly for women of color, and particularly Black women. You know, you had Dr. Ruth Simmons at Brown, you had Dr. Jackson at Rensselaer Polytech, and you had some others. And then we seemed to stall, right? And even the renowned University Spelman only recently had women serve as president. And so I think there's some tried and true methods. One of the things that's so critical is intentionality. You have to put yourself in a position where you can do those things. And there's some skills that just have to be developed. A is the ability to raise money. That's a critical aspect. And then increasingly, whether you're at a public or a private school, the political savvy. And that's just something that's really important and critical. And so I do think some intentionality is important. One of the things I share with mentees, and Dr. Platt will remember this, is that you have to get yourself a board of directors, you know, a group of, 4 to 5 people who are going to be your advocates, be your wise counsel, and where appropriate, give you the kick in the butt, right? And I think that becomes really important. And if you want to be a college president or a faculty member, whatever it is, you better get some people on your board who have actually done that.
Thank you so much, Gregory. Does anybody have any comments to tack on that? All right, then. I think we have about time for one last question. And this is one that I have been thinking about. And Dr. Buckman and I actually wrote a paper about this, but I'm wondering, what does everybody else think here? So we talk a lot about the importance and benefits of hiring diverse faculty. We see this in the research. Even the need to hire teachers of specific races and sexes. For example, we talked about Black male educators, etc. And yet, per Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, hiring based on race and sex is illegal with very few exceptions. So how does an employer, once again, I'm always thinking from that employer hat, how does an employer reconcile the seemingly contradictory messages of the law and research, especially when the fact that the law was designed, right, supposedly in a way to protect marginalized groups?
Yeah, so if you don't mind, just let me quickly address that, because this is so, in some ways, misunderstood. You mentioned the exception. Well, there's a pretty big exception. When, as a federal contractor, most institutions, educational institutions are government contractors. If you have severe underrepresentation in a particular work group or work area, you have not only the ability, but you have an affirmative obligation to aggressively address those disparities. And we don't, and to be blunt, universities don't do a good enough job of using those provisions. So if you have no women, no persons of color in your department, you have the ability to have race conscious or gender conscious strategies to address that issue. Kind of use the stick. If you don't do that, and I would think in this new administration, there may be more aggressive compliance requirements being imposed upon institutions. Better yet, saying, if you want that federal grant, show us where you're making affirmative steps. So I'll just share that as one potential opportunity.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any comments, especially maybe on the K-12 side, for example? Are these concerns things people think about? I hear people talk about it, and they might not, for example, do the homework to see whether or not they're underrepresented relative to the labor market, like you discussed, looking at those ratios.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that when I became a chief diversity officer, and I know I don't look it, but it was in 1999. And there was just a handful of CDOs in the country, and now almost every institution has a chief diversity officer. I'm seeing the same trend in K-12. We work pretty extensively with K-12 schools, and I see more and more school districts, particularly large school districts, hiring and thinking about bringing in chief diversity officers. Some of you may have seen that at the University of Kentucky. I'm serving as the program director of this new PhD specialization for senior diversity officers, right, to help educate the next generation of scholar practitioners who are going to do this work. And I just see an exploding, both on the public side, obviously public K-12, but also private institutions and charter schools as well.
Thank you. It looks like we're almost at time. Does anybody have a closing comment or thought before we adjourn?
I was just going to add that I think instead of just saying that you're going to hire people of color, that we've had very good success, I think, in the K-12 system here in Baltimore for hiring for demonstrated commitment to equity, demonstrated commitment to social justice and diversity. So really talking to people and making sure people, because even if they're people of color, they may not be coming from an equitable lens that you want in your school system. And so making sure that people have demonstrated what they've done to improve your school system, I think is how we've been successful.
Thank you, Bridget. That's actually what Dr. Buckman in my paper talks about. So I'm glad that we're on the same page with that. Thank you so much. I know that time is really important to everyone, and I don't want to take more time than we agreed upon. Thank you so much for coming and your valuable insight. I'm sure we'll keep in touch soon in the field. Thank you.